messenger runs into a crowded street, waving a sheet of paper above his head. "Read this," he shouts. "The colonies have just declared independence." Conversations stop. Shopkeepers step outside, and people gather around as the Declaration of Independence is read aloud. Some begin to cheer, but others exchange worried looks. Until that moment, the colonists had been British subjects. Now, a document was announcing that the 13 colonies were free and independent states. But the Declaration did much more than just tell King George that the colonies were leaving British control. This document argued that governments receive their power from the people and that people can replace a government that repeatedly violates their rights. So, why did the colonists believe British rule had gone too far? Which rights they believe had been violated, and what did they think their new country should stand for? Today, we're unlocking what the Declaration of Independence says, why the colonists wrote it, and how it influenced the government created by the Constitution. At Constitution Unlocked, I believe kids deserve to know their rights and understand the document that helps define them. I created this podcast to provide that foundation by explaining the Constitution's words, history, debates, and impact in a clear and engaging way. So first, why even write a declaration? By 1776, the colonists and British troops had already been fighting in the Revolutionary War for a year. Tensions were rising because the colonists believed King George III had violated their rights. However, declaring independence was still an enormous step. The colonies were not simply protesting a law or asking for a different tax. They were attempting to leave the British Empire and establish themselves as independent states. 5 people were selected to prepare the document. Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft, with input from John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston. Congress then debated and edited the document before adopting it on July 4, 1776. The Declaration did not create a system or government, establish Congress, the presidency, or the Supreme Court. Instead, it answered 2 vital questions. Why were the colonies leaving Britain, and why did they believe they had the right to leave? The most famous part of the Declaration begins with these words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." The Declaration calls certain ideas self-evident. That means that its writers believed those ideas were so clearly true that they should not require proof. The first idea was equality. However, the society that produced those words did not treat everyone equally. Millions of enslaved people were denied freedom and treated as property rather than human beings. Women lacked many legal and political rights. Native Americans were excluded from the Declaration's promise of equality and were even described using cruel and prejudiced language. Thomas Jefferson himself enslaved hundreds of people during his lifetime. So, the country's actions clearly contradicted the Declaration's claim that all people were created equal and possessed rights that cannot be taken away. However, later generations used the Declaration's own words to challenge those injustices. Abolitionists used its promise of equality to argue against slavery. Women's rights advocates modeled the 1848 Declaration of Sentiments on the Equality Clause. Civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., later called on the United States to fulfill the Declaration's promise. So, the Declaration did not create equality in 1776. Instead, its words established an ideal that future generations would use to demand greater equality. The second idea that didn't require proof in their eyes was that people possessed certain unalienable rights. Unalienable may sound complicated, but it means that these rights cannot simply be given or taken away by a ruler. The Declaration lists life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as examples. The government does not create these rights. People possess them simply because they are human. Then, the Declaration explains why governments exist in the first place. Governments are created to protect people's rights, and they receive their power from the people. That is why people elect leaders to represent them, because government is designed to serve the people and protect their rights. In simpler terms, the people do not belong to their government. the government works for the people. But what happens when a government stops protecting rights and begins violating them? The Declaration says that if a government begins taking away people's rights, the people have the right to challenge it and replace it. That doesn't mean that people should replace their government every single time they disagree with one rule. The Declaration specifically warns against changing a government for small or temporary reasons. Instead, it argues that replacing a government may become justified after a long pattern of serious abuses of rights. The colonists therefore needed to prove that British rule had become more than just a temporary problem. That's why most of the Declaration is a long list of complaints. The famous ideas about equality and rights appear near the beginning of the Declaration. But, as I said before, most of the document is something very different: a list of grievances. The colonists knew that they could not simply announce, "Hey, we don't like the king anymore." If they wanted independence to seem justified, they had to show that British rule had created a long pattern of serious problems. That's why the Declaration contains more than 24 grievances, or formal complaints, against King George III. The complaints cover many different subjects, but several of them center on one basic problem. The colonists believed that important decisions were being made about them without giving them a meaningful voice. The colonies had their own legislators. These were groups of representatives that met to discuss local problems and pass laws regarding the colonies. They were not fully democratic by today's standards because many people could not vote, but they still gave some colonists a way to participate in their government. According to the Declaration, King George repeatedly interfered with those legislators. The document accused him of rejecting laws the colonies needed, shutting legislators down, and making it difficult for representatives to meet. Imagine that your class chooses representatives to speak for it. Then, someone from a completely different school cancels their meetings, rejects their decisions, and replaces their rules without listening to anyone in your class. That is similar to how many colonists believed Britain was treating their colonial governments. They felt that whenever their representatives made a decision Britain disliked, the king could simply block it. The same problem appeared in the British Parliament, which made laws for the entire British Empire. The colonists did not elect representatives to Parliament. However, Parliament could still tax them, control their trade, and make other decisions that affected their lives. The colonists were not simply arguing that all taxes were unfair. They were arguing that a government should not tax people who had no representatives and therefore no voice in the lawmaking body creating those taxes. That belief became famous through the slogan, "No taxation without representation." Another group of complaints involved the courts. The Declaration accused the king of making judges depend on him for their jobs and salaries. The colonists worried that a judge who had to please the king might protect the king's interests instead of applying the law fairly. Think about a game in which the referee could be fired by one of the teams. The referee would have to satisfy that team by being biased toward them or risk being fired completely. The colonists believed courts worked in the same way. If judges depended completely on the king, could those judges be trusted to rule against him? The answer was no. The Declaration also accused Britain of depriving colonists of jury trials in certain cases. A jury allows ordinary citizens to examine the evidence and help decide whether someone has broken the law. The colonists viewed that protection as an important part of a fair justice system. Finally, the Declaration argued that the colonists had repeatedly asked for change. They had sent petitions describing their concerns, but they believed their request had been ignored or answered with further punishment. This point was vital to their argument. The colonists wanted to show that independence was not their first response. They claimed that they had tried peaceful solutions before deciding to separate. Together, these grievances formed the colonists' complaints against British rule. They were saying, the government has repeatedly violated our rights. We have asked it to change. It has refused. Therefore, we have the right to establish a new government. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution answer two different questions. The Declaration asks, what should a government do, and when do people have the right to replace it? The Constitution asks, How can we build a government that actually follows those principles? The Declaration was a warning about what can happen when rulers gain power without proper limits. 11 years later, the Constitution attempted to turn that warning into a working system of government. Let's connect the complaints in the Declaration to the rules created by the Constitution. We're going to be discussing the articles and amendments, which we will cover in later episodes. First, the Declaration says that government receives its power from the people, and the Constitution begins with "we, the people." That opening makes an important point. The new government would not claim its authority from a king. Its authority would instead come from the people it governed. The country did not fully achieve that ideal. At first, many people could not vote or participate equally in government. Still, we, the people, reflected the Declaration's belief that government should answer to the people, rather than rule over them. Next, consider the colonists' complaint about representation. Britain had taxed the colonies and controlled their trade, even though the colonists did not elect anyone to Parliament. The Constitution gives the power to create federal laws and taxes to Congress. The House of Representatives was designed to be elected directly by the people, while each state would also have representation in the Senate. That didn't create perfect representation, but it meant that federal taxes would have to be approved by a lawmaking body representing people from across the country. One ruler could not simply invent a new federal tax alone. The colonists also complained that King George had shut down their legislators. Under the Constitution, the president cannot dismiss Congress simply because its members disagree with the president. Congress is a separate branch with its own powers and responsibilities. That separation is part of a larger idea. No one person should control the entire government. Congress makes laws, the president carries them out, and the courts apply and interpret them. Each branch can also place limits on the other. The president can veto a bill, but Congress can override that veto. Congress can repeal and move federal officers, while courts can determine whether government actions violate the Constitution. These checks and balances were designed to prevent the kind of unchecked power the colonists believed King George had abused. The complaints about judges also influenced the new system. The colonists feared that judges who depended on one leader for their jobs and salaries would feel pressured to obey them. Article 3 of the Constitution attempts to protect federal judges from that pressure. Judges can remain in office during good behavior, and their salaries cannot be reduced while they serve. A president cannot fire a federal judge simply because that judge makes a decision the president dislikes. And that meant judges can be fair without worrying about displeasing the president. Some of the clearest connections appear in the Bill of Rights, which was added to the Constitution in 1791. We'll discuss the Bill of Rights in another episode, but all you need to know for now is that they are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution designed to protect people's rights. The Declaration complained about colonists being denied jury trials. So, Article 3 protects juries in federal criminal trials, while the 6th and 7th Amendments provide additional jury protections. The colonists had objected to British troops being kept in their homes. So, in response, the 3rd Amendment says that the government cannot house soldiers in your home without your consent. The Declaration also said that the colonists' petitions had been ignored. The First Amendment protects the right to petition the government, meaning people can formally ask their government to correct a problem. The Constitution did not simply copy sentences from the Declaration. The two documents served different purposes, and the Constitution was shaped by the ideals laid out in the Declaration of Independence. But the connection between them is important. The Declaration listed what the colonists believed a government had done wrong. The Constitution attempted to create rules that would prevent an American government from repeating those abuses. The Declaration announced the principle that government should serve the people, and the Constitution attempted to build a government capable of doing it. Let's put the Declaration's entire argument into simple language. All people possess basic rights, and government exists to protect those rights. A government's power comes from the people, not from a ruler who can do whatever they want. The colonists argued that Britain had repeatedly violated their rights. They said that they had asked the British government to change, but their request had failed. Because those abuses continued, The colonists believed they had the right to leave Britain and establish independent governments of their own. The Declaration of Independence did more than announce the birth of a new country. It presented an argument about the relationship between people and government. These basic tenets extended far beyond America's borders. Just 13 years after the Declaration of Independence, France experienced its own revolution. When the revolution began, France adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in a language that echoed many of the same principles of America's Declaration of Independence. In the 1800s, many Latin American countries modeled their call for independence and national sovereignty on the Declaration. Ultimately, the Declaration became an invitation for people around the world to ask, what makes a government truly legitimate? Okay, here's the interesting fun fact for today. The words woman, slavery, democracy, and equality actually never appear in the original Constitution, despite the Constitution significantly shaping all of those words. Thank you for listening to Constitution Unlocked. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, understanding your rights is the first step toward protecting them. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please make sure to follow us on our Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube account, or follow our Constitution Unlocked profiles on Instagram and TikTok.